welcome in to offer some perspective on conference realignment and the Big 12 and much, much more. The host of the Locked On Big 12 podcast, Josh Neighbors. Josh, welcome to the program, man.
Thanks for having me on, guys. Appreciate it.
Okay, let's talk about what came out kind of during Big Ten Media Days and more of this 16-team playoff conversation, which is fun. Do you feel like that's an inevitability, or do you think it may go to 8 or 12 before it gets to 16?
Yeah, there was some irony with having Kevin Warren be the one who said, hey, I've heard 16 out there after he shot down 12 last year. I actually hadn't heard 16 had been tossed around, right? But I hadn't heard too many people speaking about 16. That wasn't a big thing. I mean, I think that 12 model that Craig Thompson, Bob Bowlesby, Jack Swarbrick, and also Greg Sankey put together was a pretty strong model, in my opinion. I like rewarding conference champions. I like rewarding, maybe a G5 group as well. But obviously with conference realignment, who gets rewarded really has changed. So, I think the hope for the Big 12 is that they get a seat at this table. I think they should. I mean, think about it last year. Like, if there was a 12-team playoff last year, the Big 12 would have put two teams in that. Baylor and Oklahoma State, rather, would have both been in there. So, I'm not in a rush to go from 4 to 16. Maybe we do it eventually, but I thought 12 was kind of a nice place to do it. And I'm hoping whatever model we do get, we get some campus games. That's kind of a big thing for me because I'm tired of these events in these big NFL stadiums where it feels like a more corporate event than it does, Notre Dame versus Alabama or a Cincinnati versus Alabama or Georgia versus Michigan. I don't like those kind of corporate atmospheres. I want some campus games.
I think it's interesting that, obviously we don't know what criteria would follow, whether it's 12 or in this circumstance is 16. We don't know if there would be automatic qualifiers. I think most of us assume that there would be. It makes sense. I think you'd have a lot of people upset if there weren't. But do you think AQs would help or hurt the Big 12's chances of getting into a 16-team college football playoff?
The only circumstance in which it would hurt them is if the AQs it was multiple AQs in the same conference that wasn't the Big 12, right? So like if it were the Big 10 West and Big 10 East or whatever they're going to call the divisions when they have, 20 teams in it. If it's the Big 10 West champion and the Big 10 East champion both get in, and the champion of the Big 10 in the conference championship game gets the bye, right? Like if that were the way that you were doing it, that could potentially hurt the Big 12. But as long as there are AQs, I definitely don't think it's going to be a negative for the Big 12 if they're included in that. Now, maybe, the one way it could hurt them is if the committee says, well, we already filled our quota of Big 12 teams. We're not sure there's more than one deserving team. And, let's just say like last year, Baylor is at 5 and gets the AQ. And then they say, well, do we think Oklahoma State's really that good? Is that conference really that good? That could be the way it hurts them for secondary teams. But obviously, automatically getting somebody in would be helpful, generally speaking, especially after what we've seen. But I think it's 16, like you're going to have AQs. There's no way you have a 16-team playoff without having some AQs in there. I don't think you could just, seed them all 1 through 16. I don't think that would appease too many people, but we'll see. I mean, Greg Sankey and Kevin Warren seem to be the ones kind of calling the shots now, and they've kind of almost publicly acknowledged that.
Yeah, there's no commissioner of college football, but those two sort of form the most powerful two, if
the brain trust.
Mm-hmm. Right. I want to talk about parity in the Big 12. So the Pac-12 has been criticized the last several years for not having a dominant team, eating their own, if you will, not spitting out a team that even makes the playoff, and if they do, it's not that competitive. Washington 2016, for example. The Big 12, I'm excited about the parity of it, but also there's a little bit of danger in that you may not have that dominant program that can hang at that top level. What's your perception of how the league is going to perform and who that top team will be, perhaps, and how they do when Oklahoma and Texas leave?
Yeah, so, I mean, Oklahoma, you have them with the run of 6 straight conference titles through 2015 all the way through 2020, right? I mean, they were the top dogs in this conference. And then you get Baylor last year. And I think what's interesting with Baylor is they were picked to finish first in the conference this year. They have a really difficult schedule, including a road game at BYU. It's coming up in the second week of the season. I'm pretty pumped for that game. I'm sure you guys are as well. I think they're kind of in the catbird seat because when you think about Baylor football the last few years, or last like decade or so, they've had 3 separate coaches who have performed really well there. I mean, Art Briles, say what you want about Art Briles, and I've got plenty to say about that, but as a coach did a really good job. Then obviously you had Matt Rule, who is now with the Carolina Panthers, did a great job there with Baylor as well. And then you have Dave Aranda come in, and now, he has a great season, wins the Big 12 championship. So to me, I think Baylor is kind of in that position because we've seen them succeed over the last decade or so. Oklahoma State's been the most consistent over the last 2 decades because of what Mike Gundy has built. So I think they've got a really good chance to be up there too. And then I am very curious to see what happens with the new schools that you bring in. I think Houston has a chance. I think Cincinnati has a chance as long as Luke Fickell stays there. UCF, you never know what they could concoct with, obviously Gus Malzahn there. So I think all those schools have a chance, but if I were to pick one to kind of be the top dog, I would say it's Baylor in the lead. But I think as this conference is going to be competitive, and that's what's going to be fun about the conference. But I don't think we all just want the conference to be competitive. We want it to be competitive in a nationally relevant way, where everybody's not just like, oh, it's a fun 10-2, the same way an American team could be viewed as a fun 10-2. No, we want to be taken seriously, even if there is some parity in the league.
Josh, this year it's about the Big Ten making decisions and then the Pac-12 having to react to those. A year ago, it was the SEC making decisions and then the Big 12 having to make their decisions. And look, maybe it's somewhat self-serving to say this, but obviously we think they did a pretty good job on how they rebounded and brought in the schools. So this year compared to last year, where do you feel the Big 12 is, and what type of player do you expect them to be in terms of conference realignment moving forward?
Yeah, I think they're fine. I mean, you think about where we were last year, yikes, there was some serious anxiety from a lot of parties about the survival of the conference. But in kind of the long run, like, it's actually good that it happened when it did. It gave them the inside edge because the best brands of the board were UCF, were BYU, were Cincinnati, and were Houston. And actually, luckily for the conference, I mean, 12-2 was Houston, and then also Cincinnati made a playoff run, and BYU had another really good season. And then UCF, obviously, they had their issues because Dylan Gabriel getting injured, but still ended up having actually a pretty nice season record-wise. So I think they're still in a good spot. I believe that, and look, they're going to be in player and conference realignment. They're not going to have the first choice. But to me, the one advantage the Pac-12 honestly has, and this is being pointed out, is that the Pac-12 after dark games are just by themselves, which has given them some massive advantage. You're seeing all these articles written about the television advantage that these West Coast schools have. Washington State is more viewed than Oklahoma State, right? Why? They're on 11 o'clock every night. So, like, really, how much of a brand advantage is that? And I think the question is, could the Big 12 absorb those schools and also play some games later on at night to maintain those television windows? Because the Pac-12 is not liking what they are seeing in terms of the money they're being offered. So could the Big 12 dip into that television window? If they dip into the Pac-12 is actually a big question that I've had the last few days. And then also, are Oregon and Washington going to be snatched up by the Big 10? That's a huge question because those are the 2 best brands to me left on the board. The Big 12 could snag those, would be fantastic. But I think the Pac-12 is, John Wilner has been saying it's 4 teams away from getting collapsed. I think if Oregon and Washington go, it's pretty much death sentence. I mean, you can put the nail in the coffin. Or if the 4 corner schools get taken by the Big 12, that's also nail in the coffin too for that conference.
We're talking to Josh Neighbors of the Locked On Big 12 podcast. I feel the same. If 2 teams go, you're down to 8, and who are you going to add that keeps you Power 5? Maybe you still are. I don't know. But San Diego State has entered the conversation, according to Dennis Dodd, with some sources. Sources, take them for what it's worth. Should the Big 12 proactively try and get a San Diego State and or other teams that aren't in the Pac-12 before the Pac-12 perhaps adds? Because it feels like the Big 12 obviously have said, hey, we're open for business, right? But does the Big 12 need to expand to plunder the Pac-12, or does San Diego State need to come in before?
It would certainly be nice if they did expand, but they don't need it. Like, there is a reason why the Big 12 walked away from an all-out merger with the Pac-12. They actually don't straight up need that to happen for them. So that is, that they are in a position of power with that. I'll tell you what, guys, the San Diego State faithful have been in the mentions They have been in the DMs. They have been on commenting on YouTube. They want in. They want to see at the table. I don't blame them. Obviously, they're in a market in San Diego. It's one of the larger markets. It's kind of out there available right now to potentially go to, and good both football and basketball programs. So I think that they're in play, and I think the one thing to be careful with is this: like taking somebody to take them off the board makes sense only if you can make sure on the back end you're getting the teams in that you want. Because if what's going to happen here is the Big 12 is just splitting up the pie, not increasing the value, and it's basically becoming more teams, less overall value in the television contract. Well, that's not necessarily a good thing. So you have to make sure that you're making the moves for the, I know everything's the right reasons kind of out the door, but like the right financial reasons, right? You have to make sure that you're consolidating kind of power when you make this move. If you get San Diego State and Arizona, you kind of want a Utah and Arizona State to go with it, or a Colorado and somebody else, or however many schools you could pluck or plunder, to use that term. So you have to make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. But I know there are plenty of San Diego State fans out there who they would love to get in the Big 12.
And we've heard from them for a long time in the WAC and in the Mountain West. And so
you hear from them all the time.
Very familiar with the
show. The vocal group. It's a vocal group.
Absolutely.
Yes.
Absolutely. Well, Josh, we appreciate the time. Best of luck with covering all of this, and thanks for joining us.
Yeah, for sure, guys. Anytime.